Okay, so good morning, students. Welcome to this session, which I guess will be the last of my hours with you. We come to the very last topic that we have to discuss, the very last author according to the syllabus division in the department and the portions that were allotted to me. We go back to the women's writing paper, where we have one more author to discuss. And that author happens to be somebody who has played a very significant role in the very creation of that paper, that paper or that branch or that area of study. We call it women's studies. And when you think of women's studies, when you think of the key figures who have contributed much to the development of women's studies, the institutionalization of women's studies, bringing women's studies into the academic forefront, I'm sure this is a name that you cannot afford to ignore. So can you guess who that might be? Or can you just give me the names of a few writers, thinkers, and activists who have played a major role in bringing women's writing into the academic field, who gave women's writing a recognition of its own, who created or who attempted to study women's writing as part of a new tradition. Can you mention a few names in that field? Okay, Gayatri Muralidharan says Virginia Woolf, very good. Virginia Woolf, with some of her significant essays like A Room of One's Own, has definitely carved a niche for women's writing. Very good, but Virginia Woolf is not the author that I'm going to discuss. Someone else said Adrienne Rich. Yeah, Adrienne Rich is also a very significant writer and a critic too. She's a poet. We remember her mainly as a poet, but she has also contributed much by way of feminist criticism. She has also got a very important position in bringing women's writing into global recognition. Again, it's not Adrienne Rich that I'm going to discuss, but someone who has played a major role as a critic. When you think of feminist criticism, I guess this is a name that would immediately come up. One of the preeminent among the feminist critics. We're not talking about the women writers alone. We're not talking about those writers whom you can call feminists. We are thinking of a critic here, a feminist critic, somebody who brought literary criticism, feminist literary criticism, into acceptance. Who would that be? Elaine Showalter, says Jane. Yeah, and Anagha. Right, absolutely. So it is Elaine Showalter, the American critic whose work we will now discuss. Let me get the presentation ready for that, okay? Yeah, so welcome. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So this is the American critic, Elaine Showalter, who ever since, her entering the field of literary criticism and academia has played a major role, mainly with the publication of some of her significant works like A Literature of Their Own, British Women Writers from Bronte to Lessing, the 1977 work, The Female Malady, Speaking of Gender, Sister's Choice, Hysteria Beyond Freud, and Scribbling Women. These are just some of her major works, but I think the moment you think of Elaine Showalter, some of her major essays come up. Isn't that so? We're reminded of essays like Towards a Feminist Poetics. We are familiar with terms like gynocriticism. I think that is the one word that we would most associate with Elaine Showalter. If you can see, I don't know if my screen, if you can see my image too. This is the book, and one of the essays of this book is what you have to study as part of this paper, gynocriticism. So these two terms, feminist critique and gynocriticism, are attributed to Elaine Showalter, and this has actually shaped, gynocriticism has really shaped feminist literary criticism. She argued that feminist criticism actually falls into two categories. When you are taking the position of a literary critic, a feminist literary critic, you are actually taking the position either of a reader, that is, a consumer. As a reader, as a consumer, how do you analyze literary works? I think somebody is trying to get it. Yeah. Yeah, so as a consumer, how do you analyze literary works? That is what she calls feminist critique. But the more important one is gynocriticism, where the woman is presented as the producer or the writer. In feminist critique, women are mainly the consumers of a male-produced, male-oriented literature. And when you occupy the position of feminist critique, what you are concerned with would be, the way that these works, these largely patriarchal works about men, by men, and sometimes by women too, but with a very strong patriarchal orientation, they end up giving you stereotypical representations of women, and they look at the way in which patriarchy has shaped the female consciousness. That is how feminist critique works. Or when you are a feminist critique, or when you're doing feminist critique, this is what you are looking at, the way in which women have been represented in literary works and the way that the conscience of the women have been shaped by these patriarchal creations. But moving to the other end of the spectrum, the gynocriticism, gynocriticism is a more productive field. You're looking at woman as the writer here, the producer here. It attempts to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, looking at women's literature through a female framework and looking at topics and issues like women and creativity, women and subjectivity, the language used by women, the literary career of the women writers, and so on. So you're looking at it from the perspective of a woman and seeing the, the autonomous creations, the independent experiences of these women writers. So that is what Elaine Showalter has played a major role in popularizing. And today, you cannot, I think, separate feminist literary criticism and gynocriticism. And that is a major contribution to the field of literary criticism. But we are not lingering on that essay, towards the feminist poetics or feminist criticism in the wilderness. These are some of her major essays, but it's not these essays that we are going to be concerned with during the course of this hour. Of course, we need to look at Elaine Showalter and feminist literary criticism in this larger perspective. What do feminist critics do? What do you do when you are doing feminist literary criticism? You are explaining how the subordination of women is sometimes reflected and sometimes challenged by literary texts. There are certain literary texts which portray the subordination of women. There are other literary texts that challenge the subordination of women. In any case, the portrayal of women there is very significant. So looking at that, analyzing the representation of women, that is what a feminist critic basically does. And Elaine Showalter has been one of the key figures behind developing this mode of literary criticism, taking the drift away from formalist features, from the biography of the writer and so on, and looking at the way in which the female characters have been represented. So feminist critics examine the experience of women of all races, classes, sexual preferences, and cultures. This is very important for us to realize, because we know that feminist literary criticism is largely a Western enterprise. It began in some of the universities and academic centers in the West, in Europe, in centers of France, England, and then also America. Some of the key figures that you can associate with feminist literary criticism, whether it is Betty Friedan or Kate Millett or Elaine Showalter or Virginia Woolf, they belong to either the European or the American section of the world. But later critics like Gayatri Spivak, for example, have come up and challenged the Western domination and pointed out how, when you're doing feminist literary criticism, let us not assume that there is only one kind of female experience for the whole world. Everything affects the experience of women. The race that they belong to, the class that they belong to, the culture that they belong to, their sexual preferences, and so on. So you can never essentialize it. That is the full impact of feminist literary criticism, when you move much beyond Elaine Showalter and other Western critics. But we cannot even then overlook the contributions made by these people. That is why you have two essays here as part of your women's writing paper. One is by Virginia Woolf and the other is by Elaine Showalter. And the feminist critics' goal, whether they belong to the West or the East, their goal is to expose the patriarchal premises, all those things that patriarchy takes for granted and makes everyone else also take for granted, and the prejudices, the stereotypical representations, the images, the ideas, etc., that get perpetrated because of patriarchy. And they promote the discovery and re-evaluation of literature by women. That is another major goal of feminist literary criticism, rediscovering writers who had been not successful enough, not brave, not powerful enough to be published during their own lifetime. And some who were published, but whose works were so volatile and so controversial that very soon those works were also erased from public memory. And you have these new feminist critics coming up and going back to the past, doing a lot of research and helping those old writers to be rediscovered. They examine social, cultural, and psychosexual context of literature and literary criticism. And we're familiar with the three waves, the first, second, and third wave of feminism. The first wave feminism, which began with the activism that sought education for women and voting rights for women. Then you have the second wave, which was more of a protest and an activist kind of phase, where women began to fight for equality with very radical movements like the Burn the Bra movement and so on. And then you have the third wave of feminism, which moved on beyond the age of protest and activism and radical feminism, and came into a kind of a phase of self-discovery and self-expression. And today sometimes people talk about the fourth wave of feminism, with feminism aligning itself with cyber culture and post-feminism and so on. You think beyond feminism. So these are all the various phases of the feminist movement. The whole point is, you can never think of the feminist movement as being just one. You can never write about it in one sentence and put a full stop there. It is something that evolves, something that has shaped itself in various ways according to the moving times. So yeah, we now live in the 21st century, and we probably live in the era of post-feminism, where feminism is significant, but we cannot afford to remain engaged in that male-female binary. We need to think beyond that. Female experience is much beyond the male-female binary. That is what post-feminism argues. Anyway, as I reminded you earlier, we cannot afford to ignore the work of some of the early critics, and of course Virginia Woolf's essay is prescribed for your study. I think the one that is prescribed for your study is Shakespeare's sister, if I'm not mistaken, her essay in that collection, in the book, A Room of One's Own. But we need to discuss a chapter from Elaine Showalter's well-known work, A Literature of Their Own. This is a voluminous work. This is the entire book. You can see the size. This was actually her PhD work, which she later published in the form of a book. And her intention was to look at the history of women's writing in England. She analyzed the work of women writers, novelists, from Charlotte Bronte, one of the earliest among the writers, to the 20th century writer, Doris Lessing. So this 1977 work continues to have a very important standing of its own. It is a pioneering study in which Showalter created a critical framework for analyzing literature by women. This is the first time that women's writing begins to be analyzed through the lens of literary criticism. Women's writing, largely till then, was never considered as worthy enough to be discussed academically, discussed in literary circles. It was there. Women were writing. After a certain point of time, women getting educated naturally did begin to write also. But women's works never received the kind of attention that the works of the major male writers kept achieving then and now also. Anyway, so here you have this critical framework they developed in order to look at the works of these women writers. She says, let us not brush these works aside and just treat them along with other writers. You have the work of Hardy, Dickens, Lawrence, James Joyce, all the major writers. Fine, you can have that canon, but high time you recognize that women have their own literature too. And she chose this title. This was, of course, not the work title of her PhD thesis, but when she published it, her editors also suggested that she could use this, and this was actually a quotation taken from the eminent English philosopher, writer and thinker, John Stuart Mill, who in the year 1869, as early as 1869, he can definitely be considered as one of the early feminists. We think of Mary Godwin, the one who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, an 18th century classic, 19th century classic. And similarly, John Stuart Mill was also, in his work, The Subjection of Women, you have this important statement being made by John Stuart Mill. He said, if women lived in a different country from men and had never read any of their writings, they would have a literature of their own. He really pinpointed the way in which patriarchy shapes our conscience and shapes our performance also. So if women lived in their own world, they would naturally have a literature of their own. And here is Elaine Showalter arguing that women have indeed developed a literature of their own. And she studies the work of these writers not as part of a tradition dominated by male writers, but as a separate tradition altogether. You may consider it as a kind of subculture. You have the mainstream culture and then the subculture. A subculture will have its own values, conventions, experiences, and behaviors. So feminist criticism can be considered as a subculture, just like you may consider, let us say, post-colonial writing. You can think of Latin American writing. You can think of Jewish writers. All of these, they're all subcultures. And feminist literature, feminist writing, women's writing is also a subculture of its own. Of course, we are familiar with the three stages that Elaine Showalter divided women's work into. As in the case of any subculture, each subculture, whether it is post-colonial or Jewish or Latin American, that subculture will actually begin with a phase of imitation, because there would be a mainstream canon. There would be a list of writers who had already been recognized as the masters. And in this new branch of writing, the first writers would naturally tend to write in imitation of the masters of the already existing tradition. So it is with women's writing too. And she calls that phase the feminine phase. She dates it as extending from 1840 to 1880. So during that phase, you have a period of imitation, and they internalize, where the subculture largely adopts the values and the literary forms of the dominant tradition. And it is because of their tendency to write like the already established male writers that you have the widespread appearance of the male pseudonym. We know that in English literature, when it comes to the women novelists, the earliest writers, like the Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Anne Bronte, in order to get published, they chose male pen names. They were known as Ellis Bell, Cara Bell, and so on. That was, the way in which they knew that they would be accepted by the publishers. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans wrote under the pen name of George Eliot. So all of this is part of that phase of imitation. So from 1840 to 1880, you have the feminine phase, which is basically a phase of imitation. But then you move to the next phase, the very important feminist phase, from 1880 till about 1920. For 40 years, you have a powerful phase of protest. So if imitation is a characteristic feature of the feminine phase, loud protest is the characteristic feature of the feminist phase. And it totally rejects the values, the prevailing values, and begins to declare its autonomy. And this is the phase that we will be discussing. But the feminist phase, this phase of activism, this phase of advocacy and protest, also did not last, because it evolved into the female phase. From the 90s, 20s onwards till the present, we can categorize women's writing as symbolizing the female phase. What is that? A phase of self-discovery. So you move beyond the early stage of imitation, you move beyond that stage of anger and protest, and you enter a more mature, a more complete, a more confident, inward-looking phase. That is, you discover yourself and you express yourself. You cannot continue to be bothered by mere imitation or anger. You rise above that, and women begin to express themselves more confidently in a more mature manner, writing about their own experiences. They do not feel the need to cater to someone else's demands. മറ്റുള്ളവരെ ചിന്തിക്കുന്ന രീതിയിൽ നമ്മളും ചിന്തിക്കണം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മറ്റുള്ളവർ ആവശ്യപ്പെടുന്ന രീതിയിൽ നമ്മൾ എഴുതണം എന്നുള്ള ആ നിലപാടിൽ നിന്നൊക്കെ മാറി they enter the phase of self-discovery, a turning inward, a search for self-identity. You can think of the works of writers like Doris Lessing, Virginia Woolf, all these writers, they belong to the female phase right down to the present. Who are the women writers that you can think of? Margaret Atwood, anyone, all the major women writers of the contemporary times, you may say that they belong to the female phase. So these three, this three-term label that Elaine Showalter has used to divide the long history of women's writing. That is a significant point. So in this book, actually, A Literature of Their Own, it shows us the great research that Showalter has done in the field of British women writers. And what is significant about this? We are familiar with the names of the Brontes, we are familiar with the name of George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Doris Lessing. The whole world knows these writers, and we consider them as great writers. But the important worth of this book lies in the fact that it has also studied the work of the minor writers, those writers whom we have totally forgotten. I'm sure you have not heard the names of writers like Olive Schreiner, George Egerton, Sarah Grant, and so on. These are just three names that I will mention, but these are largely forgotten. At the beginning of this work, you know, she talks about women's writing. When you look at women's writing in England, it's almost like a desert in the center, surrounded on all four sides by mountains. And the mountains stand for the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Jane Austen, and then Virginia Woolf and Doris Lessing. You know, these peaks and mountains we are familiar with. But what lies in between? We think that it is a mere desert and there is no writer worthy of consideration in that area. But Elaine Showalter proves them wrong and says that there are many writers whose work we need to consider. And even though future generations may not remember them, we need to understand these as important writers. And that is what we will be doing in the course of our, the essay that is prescribed for our study. So it's a kind of rediscovery, mapping widely rather than mining deeply the territory of women's writing. So looking at all the women writers who today remain forgotten. So it is her attempt to give women their own tradition. I talked about the feminine phase, where the women began writing largely in imitation of the male writers. You can think of the works of, in spite of the restrictions that were placed, that they suffered from. You have major voices like Jane Austen, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters, who gave this feminine phase a very powerful reckoning. The feminist phase, the second phase, that is the essay that is prescribed for our study. So we'll talk about that. The phase of political involvement, where women begin to very powerfully question the patriarchal stereotyping and challenge the restrictions of women's writing, placed on women's writing, women's expression, and so on. And you have some writers whom we will be discussing. The third phase, of course, a female phase, the phase of writers like Doris Lessing, Muriel Spark, Iris Murdoch, Margaret Drabble, and all the writers, after that, they reassert their continuity with women writers of the past. It is not the feminine phase or the female phase that is prescribed for our study. In this book, there are 12 chapters, okay? Of course, in the first part, she talks about the female tradition, and finally it comes to the present, the women writers in the 20th, and we can now say the 21st century too. But in between that, chapter 7 deals with the feminist novelists, and that is the chapter that is prescribed for our study, the chapter on feminist novelists. Yeah, so in this chapter, you can just summarize it with the statement. She argues that much of feminist literature represented a reaction against the male sexual force. And the writers of this generation, whom we have largely forgotten, actually are significant. They considered it their prime duty to help the cause of other women, and they began to express themselves in writings and also kept daily and monthly journals. When you research women's writing, it is very important that you go back to these works too, and not to brush them aside as insignificant compared to great writers like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and so on. And she takes up for a special discussion. I'll just read out the names of some of the writers of the feminist phase, and tell me if you have heard at least the name of at least one of them. Okay, Olive Schreiner, Beatrice Harraden, Ethel Voynich, Mary Coleridge. The name of Coleridge is familiar, but it's not Samuel Taylor Coleridge or anyone. This is Mary Coleridge. Then you have George Egerton. These are the writers that she discusses in, or the writers who belong to that second phase, the feminist phase, 1840 to 1920. None of whom are today familiar. No one would know the names of these writers or their works. And she takes up for discussion mainly three writers. The first of that is Olive Schreiner, who lived from 1855 to 1920. She was actually a South African author who, like Doris Lessing, many years later, also moved from South Africa to England. And her work, the novel, a long novel that she wrote named The Story of an African Farm, she wrote it using a pseudonym, a male pseudonym, Ralph Ine. She was very much inspired by Ralph Waldo Emerson. That is why she chose the name Ralph for herself. And in the novel, some of the characters are also named Waldo and M, much naming them after her favorite writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So this is the story of an African farm, set in an African farm, and then there you have a central character, a girl named Lindol. Nobody remembers Lindol today, even though you may remember Emma, you may remember Jane Eyre and so on, but nobody would remember Lindol. But Lindol actually can, on many counts, be considered as one of the first feminist characters, totally feminist characters. So it was actually an original book, an original work. It had a great deal of strength, but unfortunately, it remained forgotten. That is what she analyzes. There is an assured handling of narrative. She writes in a very confident manner. She describes the exotic African background, South African background quite well. There is a vigorous expression of feminist and even anti-Christian views, very bold writing. You have her criticizing the church, institutions like religion, the marriage and so on. And therefore, during its own time, it was actually quite controversial, but unfortunately, it died a preeminent death, or nobody remembered it after that. And the case of Olive Schreiner, says Elaine Showalter, is very significant. You can consider Olive Schreiner as representing, she embodies the feminist face in her work, in her life, and in her present state of being forgotten. You can see the characteristic features of the feminist face. So that is why she takes her up for discussion. Before coming to Olive Schreiner, you have a lengthy discussion on Olive Schreiner. You have a general reference to the feminist novelists. The early phase, till then you had when you were writing a novel, it was expected to make it a huge novel. She calls it the three-decker novel. And there were many writers, who were capable of writing these lengthy, voluminous novels. But needless to say, most of them were male writers, not the ones who would be, pressurized by the domestic work. They did not have to bother about the work in the great Indian or the great English kitchen. And they did not have to be bothered by domestic labor. They had a lot of free time during which they could devote themselves entirely to their writing. Now, this trend of the three-decker novel, it's like a three-tier bus, a three-decker novel, huge novel. This trend of the three-decker novel more or less came to an end by the middle of the 19th century. And then short stories came into their own, short publications, newer kinds of publications made shorter writings popular. And that was actually very conducive to these writers. You have now a group of women writers emerging who were very much involved in the public sphere. They were great activists. They were fighting for women's rights. They were fighting for women's education. They were fighting for voting rights and so on. On various levels, they were activists. But they also could get themselves published. And they did not have to be pressurized by the necessity to publish long, lengthy, three-decker novels. So this is how you find the emergence of a new generation of writers who were activists in public and who also spend some time in writing and getting themselves published through novels, shorter novels than the pre-death novels, but novels nevertheless. But that is precisely the point. Because they were so involved in these protest movements, they were fighting for various causes. We'll just read out some of the causes that they were fighting for. As a result of which, they could not really devote themselves to their writing. And their careers actually became divided between these two concerns. On the one hand, the pull to get engaged in political action for reform, to speak up for women, that was very, very strong. On the other hand, you have this urge to spend some time in private with oneself, writing down what one experiences and so on. So these women were actually torn in between these two forces, and unfortunately, that is what led to their largely unfinished, unfulfilled potential. Each one of them was a writer with great potential, but because they were too actively involved in activism and could not therefore spend too much time to devote to writing, unfortunately, they could not develop themselves as eminent writers. They could not, in other words, live up to their full potential as writers. So this is how she sums up that phase. She talks very significantly about the features of this phase, about how the women, they were very, very supportive. They knew that there were women, other women like them who also wanted to write. They formed associations, literary associations, and there was a great deal of support that the women gave each other. And it was also an age of great freedom. They could write in any way they wanted. Society had become more and more exposed to new ways of writing and so on. And, they did not have they were not forced actually to write under male pseudonyms. Some of them, of course, chose male pseudonyms, but it was not as if that was a condition for getting themselves published. They could write in a candid manner, വളരെ ഓപ്പൺ ആയിട്ട് അവരുടെ ഇന്നർ ഏർജസിനെ കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ എഴുതാമായിരുന്നു. അതിനും ഒരു റീഡർഷിപ്പ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ആൻഡ് പബ്ലിഷിംഗ് ഹൗസസ് were willing to publish these very openly expressed works, very candid, വളരെ frank ആയിട്ടുള്ള എഴുതുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ. And there was everything that was available. They had great freedom, they had readership, they had great potential, they were educated, they had read enough to create new ways of writing. They had the support of each other. Idellam undairunnu. But along with all that, they were also great associationists. The feminists were great associationists, and they unfortunately dissipated their energies in many causes. Anything and everything was taken up by them with great vigor. Like, for example, the Women's Vegetarian Union, the Anti-Vivisection League, the Anti-Spitting Association, the Psychic Society, the Anti-Tobacco Society, the Anti-Narcotic League, the Anti-Caged Bird Society. These were just some of the associations that all these women were part of. They believed that, what women could contribute to these associations was very, very significant. Men cannot, speak up against spitting, against tobacco, against the menace of smoking, against caging up animals. What women can do, only women can do. And they were very truly they recognized that. But unfortunately, because of that fierce activism, they got too much involved in that. They knew very clearly what they were against. എന്തിന് എതിരാണ് അവർ നിലപാടെടുക്കുന്നത് എന്ന് വളരെ ക്ലിയർ ആയിരുന്നു. But unfortunately, only vaguely did they realize what they stood for. അവരുടെ സ്വന്തം ആ സ്വത്വം എന്ന കാര്യത്തിനോട് അവർക്ക്, unfortunately, they could not show too much of attention. The feminist writers were engaged in the kind of quarrel that, according to Yeats, W.B. Yeats, leads to rhetoric but not poetry. rhetoric, fine rhetoric and powerful speeches, very, very powerful writing, but it does not reach the level of poetry. Our great writing, that, that stamp that you associate with great writing, our level, our height, ഇവർക്ക് achieve ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റില്ല because they were getting engaged in all these other activities. അങ്ങനെ ഉള്ള ഒരു സാഹചര്യത്തിലാണ് you can take the example of Olive Schreiner, her work, The Story of an African Farm. It is a very important work. Later writers like Virginia Woolf, Doris Lessing, ഇവരൊക്കെ, they have actually spoken very highly about Olive Schreiner. In fact, in one of her works, you have her, ഈ ഒരു വർക്കാണ് ഇത്, the second one, From Man to Man എന്ന ആ ബുക്കിൽ, the first is The Story of an African Farm, second work, From Man to Man, Olive Schreiner's, it is there that you actually have the image of a room of one's own. And Virginia Woolf herself has actually attributed the image of a room of one's own to Olive Schreiner. പക്ഷേ when you talk about a woman, a room of one's own today, whom do we remember? We don't remember Olive Schreiner. We remember Virginia Woolf. Why? Because Virginia Woolf, in spite of the little bit of activism that she got engaged in, she rose above that. And she devoted more of her time to discovering herself and expressing herself. അത് ആണ് unfortunately ഇവർക്ക് എഴുതാൻ പറ്റിയില്ല. So, she got engaged in writing in a very, very ecstatic manner. But at the same time, she was equally ecstatic about the other activities. Olive Schreiner embodied the confused aspirations, dreams, and claustrophobic femaleness of the feminist ethic. The kind of aesthetic, the kind of restrictions that women were placed under. Either Olive Schreiner very clearly eduthu kaatti. In the essay, you have Elaine Showalter quoting profusely from this work and writing in detail about Olive Schreiner. Her work, a novel in Lindol, as I told you, Lindol in the character, she's a very powerful feminist character. അതുവരെ അങ്ങനെ ഒരു character English literature ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. And the way that she has used some images, the way she has described the African background, the exotic, background, all of that, her language, the images, the power, for all of that, Olive Schreiner is very, very significant. The private room that she chose as an image in From Man to Man. But in spite of that, where is Olive Schreiner today? And same is the case with another writer of the feminist space, who is Sarah Brand. Are you familiar with her? Not at all. Her work, The Heavenly Twins, is again an important work, but not a great work. She too began with a great deal of potential. But in her own way, she got engaged with so many approaches that ultimately she could not develop as a great writer and give herself more time to writing. In fact, in her case, very much like the women in her novel, Heavenly Twins, in the novel The Bullet, she, in her personal life also, she suffered a great deal because of this, fears, activism, and so on. So, not being able to devote time to oneself and one's potential, one's gift as a writer. That's recognized the other way. Not everyone can write. Everyone can, go out there and fight, but not everyone can write in the Karyam. Unfortunately, they did not recognize. A third such writer is George Egerton. Again, a writer whom we today don't even hear about. Two of her major works, Keynotes, Discords. I think the names of those titles are very, very significant. Her work is among the most powerful writings by women of the 19th and early 20th century. And she spoke very powerfully, demanding for women's education, financial independence, and sexual freedom. But unfortunately, very often in this work, as it happens in works like Discords, what you have is she pits women against women in these works. And you feel as if she's not really addressing the real issue. How women suffer എന്നുള്ളത് വളരെ ഡീപ്പായിട്ട് അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യാതെ you have the women representing two ways of life getting into a kind of discord, a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, for example, that kind of very limited, narrow presentation. Unfortunately, that is what stands out in her work. So, by giving us the example of these three writers, Olive Schreiner, Sarah Grant, and George Egerton, who wrote very powerful works during those times, Elaine Showalter points out the significant features of the feminist phase. Each one of these writers was important. They gave women's writing a new direction. They gave women's writing a lot of power, but it stopped with just that. In retrospect, I'll just read the concluding paragraph in this. She says, the feminist novels had this, ultimately, when you look back now, you realize that they had just one story to tell. And what was that? About the new woman, the new educated woman who was aware of the oppression all around her that she suffered and against which she felt the need to fight. But unfortunately, these writers exhausted themselves in its narration. Avada ninnu poi. They could not rise beyond that. They represent a turning point in the female tradition. They turned inward and they upheld a sense of unity, a mission, a real concern for womanhood and women's writing. Idokka valare, you cannot afford to forget these contributions made by the feminist writers. However, their works did not achieve much more than that spirit of activism. And even though they had everything, they had the freedom, they had the education, they had their individuality to explore their experience and write about it with great intensity, somehow, for whatever reason we do not know, they seem to have stayed away from it. Athratholam avaru poyilla. They did not go to that very deep, intense level where they could have written about their own experiences. Adina nammalku korchu varshangal kuda kazhiyendi vannu. We had to wait till the writings of Virginia Woolf and Doris Lessing and all to achieve that kind of intensity. These women were somehow, for some reason, because of some kind of pressure probably, they just could not reach that level. And that is why they largely remain forgotten today. It is a sad part of women's writing, but at the same time, as she has rightly pointed out in this work, nammalku ee oru middle illade you cannot consider the entirety of women's writing. We respect the early writers, we respect the newer writers, we sadly forget the writers who belong to the middle phase. Avarude achievements, what they contributed to women's writing, is something that we cannot afford to forget. And that is why she's written very profusely about them and also pointed out what they should have done if they had to be remembered by posterity. Adugondana, in the last part of the essay of that chapter, she gives us a quotation, or she reminds us of a statement made by the great writer Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov's novel Lolita, you are familiar with that. Lolita എഴുതാനുള്ള inspiration കുറിച്ച് Nabokov has spoken about that. And he says he was greatly inspired by a newspaper report about an ape in a zoo in Paris. Now, there was a scientist who took great pains to teach this ape to draw and paint. He just wanted to prove that these animals can be made to do. The ape, is just one early form of the human race in the Karnikan Vendi. And with proper training, they can also be made to draw and paint in a scientist in the Udesham. And so he taught the ape, the monkey, to draw in the zoo. Azula irikina ee monkey paint and padipichu. And then came the first drawing from the monkey. What did the monkey draw? Did the monkey draw the beautiful Paris landscape? Did the monkey draw the forest? Did the monkey draw the mountains or the seas or the skies? No. What did the monkey draw? The monkey drew the bars of its cage. അതൊരു കേജിനുള്ളിലാണല്ലോ, അത് ആ ബാർസ് ആണ് പെയിന്റ് ചെയ്തത്. In spite of being trained to express itself creatively, the monkey spoke about its restricted stage. That is what, I mean, she uses this image to signify the feminist writers. It was almost as if they had everything. They had the training, they had the education, they had the freedom, they had the potential. But in spite of that, in their works, what you see highlighted is the great restriction placed on their life. So it ended up equating. I'll just read that last stanza. In Lolita, Nabokov tells a story of a monkey at the zoo. The creature's first painting showed the bars of its cage. It is a pity that the feminists, showing the limits of their world in their writing, also elevated their restricted view into a sacred vision. Ultimately, this is what they ended up projecting. Not their inner potential, not their creativity, not their own experience, but the limited restriction, the limitations and the restrictions that they experienced. They had the potential to do so much more, but unfortunately, they ended up equating their writing with that restricted vision. So this was the problem of the feminist phase. Of course, Elaine Showalter does not stop with them. She goes on to talk about the female phase and the great writers who today make up the female tradition, or the writing, women's writing, the tradition of women's writing. We could well have, been prescribed an essay about the feminine writers, the Brontes or the or George Eliot or Jane Austen. We could well have been given one of the essays here about the later writers like Virginia Woolf or Doris Lessing and all the other writers. But I think it is very important that we get to know about the contributions of the feminist writers who sadly remain forgotten today. And the reason for that is something that we cannot afford to overlook. So I think it's a terrific piece of work done by Elaine Showalter, in which you also have a great deal for yourself. Isn't that so? Always live up to your potential. Never let your restrictions limit you. Do not wallow in your restrictions. Fly high with the potential that you have. I think that is the wish that I would like to leave with you, dear students, as we say goodbye to this association. I think I've been associated you largely only for the last 1 year. So, best wishes. I think the commerce students are joining now, so I will stop the presentation now and the third year students may leave. Okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.